Welcome back, leaders. This is Key Steps for Returning to School, a support guide for strategic planning, our four-part series. This is part 4, clarifying your assessment continuum. We wanted to remind you that every resource that we have developed and all of these sessions take your culturally diverse and multilingual learners into account in terms of how we think about planning for them equitably and really engaging students throughout the course of learning as we start a new school year in a new way. I'm Melissa Lambert, and this is my fabulous colleague,
Joe
Joe.
Sassone. Well, thanks
Yay.
everybody for coming to part 4. So I think this is a rich resource that I think that will help you as you return to school. And this is a photo that I took in Montauk, Long Island, at sunrise. It was about 5:15 in the morning and 40 degrees. I was freezing. But what I want to do is just a few years ago, I wanted to develop my skills in photography and stumbled on a virtual academy. And it was built on a very old idea, the master apprentice relationship. And my educational path was structured around the concept of levels and spheres. And levels are small steps, while spheres were major phases when competing levels. And a sphere typically had about 20 levels, and completing about 20 levels took me between 3 and 6 months. The topics I worked on and the depth of my learning and the cadence with which I progressed were totally dependent on me. I worked very closely with a master photographer, and I had fellow apprentices, about 15 apprentices. And my first online meeting with my master was a Google Hangout. And I had to submit my 5 best photographs for critique as my fellow apprentices joined in to cheer on me. And you can tell I was pretty nervous about that. And the general structure of my work was follows. I created images following deep asynchronous instruction by my master. I received in-depth feedback from my master, but also my fellow apprentices. And my master helped me develop individual, realistic, and actionable goals for my work. There were very specific goals tailored to my photography. And my cohort of apprentices was exclusive and private. This was a safe place for me where I could be myself, I could be vulnerable, and exposing myself to an extent that may seem uncomfortable, but was important for my learning to be successful. And in my cohort, we displayed images that I was not certain about. I asked for help without having to fear rejection and humiliation about what I was going to show. Everyone was in the same situation, and we were more than willing to help each other improve. So, my journey through this apprenticeship, my journey helped me grow as an individual and helped me grow as an artist. And I gained self confidence, and I learned how to be objective about my work, and I learned how to help others throughout the process. So, why do I share this experience with you? Well, my progression through levels and spheres was a productive struggle. Productive struggle means grappling with learning and the difficulty in applying new learning to everyday practice. It involved me freeing me to make mistakes and creating an academically and emotionally safe place to do the work. And if you can combine productive struggle with a readiness pre assessment and formative assessment practice, it's the antidote for unfinished learning. So, in parts 1 through 3 of this series, research and resources have been shared to support your high quality Tier 1 instruction, and as well as your instructional theory of action to accelerate learning. Remember, we want to accelerate, not remediate. So, creating an inclusive, integrated, and engaged learning community starts with your leadership. And as your team works to align and clarify the assessment continuum to inform and accelerate learning, we underscore the importance of understanding the purpose of assessments. within the instructional cycle. And we want to offer some new ways of thinking about assessment and help you make connections to accelerate learning. As you continue this quality review, analyze your assessment continuum. So we're going to go through three main points today in part 4. One is we're going to define the types of and purpose of assessment. Second, we're going to understand the benefits and features of high quality pre-assessment. And we're going to clarify the connection of assessments to the understand, identify, take action cycle. So this is this graphic actually shows you the assessment continuum. Let me just make it bigger for you. So this graphic shows how these broad assessment categories can provide information along assessment continuum. The grain size, the size and scope of learning goals assessed becomes larger along the continuum. Assessments along the continuum should provide information to classroom teachers at the instructional level. So formative assessment or just-in-time assessment provides real-time information at a fine grain size that the teacher and the student can act upon immediately or in the near future. And we propose that you use an assessment continuum like the one displayed here for a unit of study to address unfinished learning. If you look at the assessment continuum, it starts with readiness pre-assessment when you want to address unfinished learning. And that we're not talking about tests here, we're talking about pedagogy. So how can you use a pre-assessment before a unit begins to give yourself information about what students know, what they may not know, and especially what they may know for pre-identified skills and understandings that they may have had the year before when we had the shutdown. And then there's formative assessment practice. This is what the teacher does minute by minute and day by day. And then weekly. We call this the short assessment cycle. So whatever a teacher does minute by minute and day by day has the most impact on student achievement. And we all know that. And then what a teacher does, or a group of teachers or subject area teachers, what they do week by week, such as classroom assessment and relearning opportunities, that is the mid-cycle of assessment. And that also has powerful impact on student achievement if it's done correctly. And then as we move along the continuum to the right with performance-based assessments that may measure what students know at the end of a unit, and then if you use an interim benchmark assessment, that's in the long cycle. And the long cycle, there are benefits to student achievement, but again, you have to have some processes in place, strong, powerful PLCs. You have to look at data, and then you actually have to have an action cycle associated with these for them to be impacted. So what we're going to spend time today on the continuum is really look at readiness pre-assessment to help you get ready before a unit starts. And we're also going to look at formative assessment. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into those two parts of the continuum. Again, these two are probably a workshop all on their own. But we're just going to go through some of the general information that you may want to be aware about. So what we're going to ask you to do is we're going to ask you to go to your resource guide and read page 1 and 2 and discuss these two questions. Do all educators have a clear understanding of your assessment continuum and how to use just-in-time assessment practice to immediately inform and accelerate learning? And the second question is, what are the key components of your assessment system? And how do you pivot the continuum if you're in a remote learning environment or a hybrid learning environment? So take some time, have that discussion, and then we'll come right back. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a rich discussion around the continuum. And what we're going to discuss now is the readiness pre-assessment. So readiness pre-assessment enables the teacher to look inside students' minds and ask, what's going on in here? Without pre-assessment, it can be all too easy to make false assumptions about what students do and don't understand on the basis of preconceived impressions about unfinished learning. And we're talking taking a more narrowed approach to pre-assessment here as you apply an accelerated learning model. And to harness the power of pre-assessment, to move learning forward, you must craft sound, efficient pre-assessment instruments and use those instruments thoughtfully to drive your instructional planning. It serves as an antidote for whole class review. Teachers can use a readiness pre-assessment to give themselves a quick snapshot of what students know and can do relative to the important concepts of the upcoming unit of instruction. And it's easy to gather evidence about students' prerequisite knowledge, skills, and understanding needed to access the concepts in the next unit of instruction. So there are 5 characteristics to consider. I'm just going to go back down here. There are 5 characteristics to consider for writing this pre-assessment. Number 1 is, before planning your next unit of study, capture students' reasoning through a few open response questions tied to an important goals of the unit and prerequisite knowledge and skills. The second is, you want to seek to discover what students actually do know instead of seeking to confirm what they don't know. The third characteristic is, give students different and multiple ways to show what they know. Fourth, ensure that it's accessible to all your students in your classroom. And number 5, consider if unfinished learning is present for the whole class or a small group. You can do this all before your unit starts with a powerful readiness pre-assessment to gather that type of information so you can make instructional lesson plan design strategies. So what we'd like you to do again is, we're going to ask you to stop and read, and using your current return scenario, whether you're remote, hybrid, or in person, and applying the instructional framework that we discussed in part 2. So you may want to take that out. That's in part 2, your instructional framework. And then also in part 3, we went through the understand, identify, and take action cycle. We would like you to have those 2 frameworks out in front of you as you discuss this next question. So in your resource guide, brainstorm how you can use readiness pre-assessment practices in an asynchronous and synchronous sessions. And then think about your scenario as well as you have those discussions. So please take some time, have those discussions around readiness pre-assessment, and then we will come back and discuss formative assessment. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had rich discussions around the pre-assessment cycle, the first important step of this continuum as we deal with unfinished learning. So formative assessment is the essential purpose of a formative assessment as a practice is to move students' learning forward while learning is still in the process of developing. So that was key to my learning in photography. I had a master and I had fellow apprentices who I can work with, who understood if it was capturing light, if it was making sure I was using the right settings, if it was work on composition or colors, or we had a process that we had to learn to actually develop the photo using multiple layers of light. In that whole process, my learning continued to move forward, and I constantly got feedback on that learning. So that's what really formative assessment is how do you move students' learning forward while learning is still in the process of developing. This is what a teacher can do minute by minute and day by day in the cycle. It has tremendous power. And this stands in contrast to other forms of assessment, which evaluate learning after a period of teaching. So formative assessment, or just-in-time assessment practice, operates as a feedback loop in which both the teacher and the student play an active, distinctive, yet complementary role in enabling learning by consistently working to build and consolidate student understanding and skills during the course of a lesson. Now, formative assessment is not a test. So when you go a little further in the continuum, like weekly or unit or quarterly, that's a summative test where you're summing up learning. But formative is a pedagogy. So that's what makes it so powerful. So let's explore what this looks like in the classroom. The, the formative assessment process occurs throughout learning, and it often looks and feels like a classroom activity, a discussion, or assignment. And when used formatively, activities inform next steps for students and teachers. It involves an ongoing cycle of actions, and that is the key to remember here when you think about formative assessment. It involves an ongoing cycle of actions. It asks three questions: where am I going? Where am I now? And where to next? And first, students and teachers clarify the intended learning. Where are we headed and why? Then teachers elicit and gather evidence of what teachers think and know and do. And students and teachers interpret the evidence by comparing it to learning goal, the success criteria. Then teachers act on the information to move students' learning forward. This process must be fluid, and it informs both students and teacher actions. Formative assessment practice, when implemented effectively, can have powerful effects on learning. Formative assessment involves teachers making adjustments to their instruction based on evidence collected and providing students with feedback that helps them advance their learning. And students participate in the practice of formative assessment through self and peer assessment. So what we'd like you to do for this next question, I'm going to pop ourselves back here. Here we are back. Is using your current return scenario, either your remote, hybrid, or in person, and applying the instructional framework from part 2 and the understand, identify, and take action cycle in our resource guide from part 3. Brainstorm how you can use formative assessment practices in synchronous and asynchronous sessions. So take some time, have those discussions as you think about strategy and putting this all together for yourself. And we'll come right back. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some rich discussions on how you can use formative assessment practice in asynchronous and synchronous sessions. Formative assessment at a distance is challenging, but it is possible. And we still need to check for understanding and provide meaningful feedback. So here are 5 ideas to consider when you're thinking about formative assessment at a distance. Number 1, know your purpose. There are many tools to use to elicit evidence of learning. And as it is important to have routines, it is still have variety. Ask teachers to select 2 to 4 tools that work well for them and their students. Focusing on just a few allows students to experience tools they're used to, and while also ensuring that checking for learning doesn't get boring. Number 2, collect evidence of learning over time. So formative assessment is a process, and it's important to collect evidence of learning over time. And while you may teach and dictate which digital tools students can use, work with students to have them document their learning along the way. Give them guides, checkpoints, and let them know what they need to submit when they need to do so. Number 3, focus on feedback. So when you elicit evidence of learning, it's important to communicate the feedback that comes from it. Teachers can provide written or oral feedback through videos, sound recordings. During synchronous sessions, teachers can put students in breakout groups and provide feedback where they can provide feedback to one another. Asynchronously, students can post work and provide feedback over a longer period of time. So, number 4, check for understanding is synchronous sessions. Those in the moment checks for understanding that we did in the classroom were valuable. and allowing us to adjust instruction and meet students where they are. But that kind of check in is still important. So some synchronous tools have built in formative assessment capabilities, such as a thumbs up, a thumbs down buttons. And you can have private chat features that can allow you to know in real time what students know and don't know. These check ins help teachers provide just in time feedback and can guide their thinking about who might need further support later through resources, intervention, or small group instruction through breakout groups in a synchronous session. And finally, number 5, check in on social emotional learning. In addition to checking on academic learning, be sure to check in on students' well being and their overall distance learning experience. Simple questions can prompt students to their sharing their feedback, like what's working, what's not working, what would you recommend? This is crucial because the way of learning is newer for almost all of us and thus requires ongoing reflection and feedback. I just want to share a quick little story with you. This morning, a neighbor down the road texted us and asked if we could work with their fourth grader grandchild, and he suffers from ADD, and he also suffers from dyslexia, and he's going to school as a special ed student only 1 day a week and 4 days remote. That's a challenge for the family. It's a challenge for this 10-year-old boy. How do you supply those services in a remote setting and check for understanding through powerful pre-assessment and powerful formative assessment practices in a situation like that? So the parent is actually reaching out to tutors so she can get extra support. And I think the question for all of us as educators is, what can we do to make sure that we provide students a powerful experience through distance learning or a hybrid model that they would get in person? So I think that's the challenge for all of us. So these are some ideas that you can think about as you think about your own continuum. I'm going to ask Melissa just to kind of wrap up for the part 4 series. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I hope that we gave you some good tidbits of information to kind of think about as you develop your strategy.
I also want to thank everybody for participating in this series and to reiterate how important it is to have really clear learning targets, learning intentions, and success criteria that understand step in the understand, identify, and take action cycle is so important. And really, that assessment continuum lives in that cycle, and that cycle lives in your instructional framework. And that instructional framework really is there to be inclusive, it's there to be integrated with targeted support and provide synchronous, asynchronous learning opportunities, as well as that very important feature of monitoring and ongoing communication with families and students. We thank you so much. If you need more information or any clarification, we're always available at fosteringqualityschools.com. Our emails are here. Feel free to reach out to us individually. And we thank you so much for your participation.
Thanks, everybody.